At precisely 5:30 a.m., the calm waters of the Caribbean erupted into one of the largest naval counter-narcotics operations in modern history. Radar operators aboard U.S. Navy destroyers and Coast Guard cutters had been tracking suspicious convoys for days, but on this morning the signals converged into a single undeniable picture: a fleet of cartel vessels, carrying what intelligence later confirmed to be 76,000 pounds of narcotics, valued at a staggering $473 million. The smugglers had chosen speed and stealth as their weapons. They deployed go-fast boats equipped with powerful engines, semi-submersibles designed to skim beneath the waves, and escort craft manned by heavily armed crews. Together they formed a drug armada built to slip through shipping lanes and vanish into the expanse of open water. Their destination, American shores and the black markets that fuel a criminal empire. But what they did not count on was that the United States had already shifted its defenses far forward. Navy destroyers were on station in deep water, supported by Coast Guard cutters spread across the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean. High-endurance patrol aircraft swept hundreds of miles daily, while Poseidon reconnaissance planes traced faint heat signatures across the waves. Above all, drones loitered high, relaying coordinates to command centers. This was not a reactive defense. This was forward interdiction, stopping cartel fleets before they could even approach American territory. The first signs of direct contact came off the shipping approaches near Central America. A cluster of fast-moving contacts appeared on radar running north. Their speed exceeded 40 knots, leaving telltale wakes visible to reconnaissance aircraft. Door gunners aboard Navy helicopters trained their sights, prepared to use disabling fire aimed at engines, a tactic refined over years of Coast Guard operations. Every rule of engagement was followed. First came commands over loudspeaker ordering the vessels to stop. Then warning shots cracked across the surface of the sea. Still, the cartel crews pressed forward. At that moment, the quiet surveillance phase ended, and the interdiction phase began. The scale of what unfolded was unlike anything seen in more than a century of Coast Guard operations. Nearly 24 separate pursuits began across 3 weeks of non-stop missions. Off the Galapagos, a narco submarine was intercepted carrying more than 8,000 pounds of cocaine. Near the coast of Mexico, a cutter boarded another vessel hauling 9,000 pounds of contraband. South of Jamaica, helicopters disabled 2 go-fast boats in a single day, seizing another 6,500 pounds. By the time the seizures were tallied, the total had reached a staggering 76,000 pounds, equivalent to 23 million lethal doses, enough to kill the population of Florida several times over. Yet the drugs were only half the story. 34 suspected cartel operatives were pulled from those vessels at sea, not street-level couriers, but trusted crews chosen to move multi-million-dollar shipments through international waters. Analysts emphasize that each arrest cut directly into the cartel's infrastructure, removing skilled navigators and replacing them with desperate recruits. The human cost to the cartels would ripple long after the bales were cataloged and stacked on Coast Guard decks. But for U.S. forces, the challenge had only begun. Every bale seized created new logistical demands. Decks were crowded with evidence that had to be guarded, tagged, and transported under an airtight chain of custody. Crews rotated in shifts, patrolling by day and guarding cargo by night, all while still at sea. The operation was already historic, the largest seizure in Coast Guard history. But as one commander admitted, this was not just about drugs or boats. It was about strategy and about sending a message to the cartels that the sea was no longer their sanctuary. The question now was simple. If a cartel armada worth nearly $500 million could be trapped, what would they risk next? What made Operation Pacific Viper extraordinary was its sheer scope. Instead of one isolated seizure, the United States launched a synchronized campaign across the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Nearly 20 separate smuggling attempts were intercepted in just 3 weeks, a pace that stunned even veteran commanders. Each encounter followed the same escalating sequence: identification, verbal commands, warning shots, and finally disabling fire aimed at engines. Every step was recorded under international law, every action documented for prosecution. Observers emphasized that the U.S. did not rely on luck, it relied on integration. Navy destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, patrol aircraft, drones, and allied partners working as one. Cartel vessels that once counted on speed now faced precision firepower from helicopters. Semi-submersibles, once nearly invisible, were tracked by advanced sonar and aerial surveillance. Crews that had once boasted of outrunning patrols found themselves caught in coordinated traps. What made this different from past operations was not just the firepower, it was the deliberate choice to push enforcement far offshore. Instead of waiting near American shores, U.S. commanders deployed assets deep into international waters, turning the convoy's long journey into their greatest vulnerability. The seizures mounted 8,000 pounds here, 9,000 there, 6,000 more. Each load represented millions in cartel profit, erased before it ever touched U.S. soil. By the end of August, the combined haul was valued at nearly $473 million. Analysts calculated that this figure equaled months of operating capital for entire trafficking networks. Yet officials warned that numbers alone did not tell the full story. The real impact lay in the arrests. 34 suspected operatives were detained at sea during the same sweep, and subsequent tallies pushed the total to nearly 60 individuals across multiple crews. These were not expendable street recruits. They were trusted navigators, radio operators, and engineers, men trained to guide semi-submersibles and armored go-fast boats through high-risk waters. Every detention removed skilled manpower from the cartel system. Replacing them would take time, training, and resources. In the meantime, cartel bosses faced a dilemma: risk shipments with inexperienced crews or pause operations entirely. Either option cost money, credibility, and control. While the seizures grabbed headlines, the logistics behind them became a story of their own. Decks of cutters overflowed with bales of cocaine and marijuana, stacked shoulder high, each tagged and logged as evidence. Crews rotated to stand guard even as their ships remained on patrol. Analysts in Washington pointed out that the presence of heavily armed Navy warships alongside Coast Guard boarding teams signaled a new phase, one where drug interdiction was no longer viewed as purely a law enforcement mission but as a joint security operation requiring military-grade deterrence. Critics asked whether such a massive mobilization was sustainable. Deploying destroyers costs millions per week. But commanders countered that the cost of inaction would be far higher. Each shipment that reached U.S. shores fueled addiction, violence, and corruption on both sides of the border. The historic nature of the seizure also raised strategic questions. Was this surge in cartel activity a temporary spike, or was it evidence of a broader shift? Analysts speculated that cartels might be consolidating loads into larger convoys, betting that sheer size and numbers would overwhelm patrols. If so, the gamble had failed spectacularly. By mid-August, the U.S. had made its point. No matter how many boats, no matter how stealthy the subs, no matter how experienced the crews, the combined might of the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard could and would shut them down. But behind every tactical victory lurked a larger geopolitical shadow, because one ship in particular, the USS Cole, had reappeared on the front lines, and its presence carried a message that went far beyond drugs or cartels. When the dust settled from the record-breaking seizures, one name dominated the briefings: the USS Cole. To many Americans, the destroyer is not just a warship. It is a symbol of tragedy and resilience. On the 12th of October, 2000, in Aden Harbor, Al-Qaeda operatives rammed a small boat packed with explosives into the Cole's hull. The blast ripped a 40-foot hole in the side of the ship, killing 17 sailors and wounding dozens more. For days, the crew fought to keep her afloat, refusing to abandon ship even as water poured into the compartments. The attack shocked the nation and marked one of the most painful chapters in modern naval history. Now, 25 years later, the Cole had returned, not as a victim, but as a hunter. Modernized, rearmed, and upgraded, the destroyer steamed into the Caribbean at the head of Operation Pacific Viper. Its presence was not routine. Destroyers are rarely deployed for counter-narcotics. But in this case, the Navy wanted to send a message to cartels, to allies, and to Washington itself. On-board Coast Guard law enforcement detachments launched boarding teams using the destroyer's flight deck as their staging area. MH-60R Seahawk helicopters lifted off under the Cole's command, swooping down to disable cartel speedboats with precision fire aimed at outboard engines. Boarding teams rappelled down to decks, securing smugglers and marking the bales of seized contraband. For cartel crews, seeing the Cole appear on the horizon was a shock. These men were accustomed to dodging cutters or outrunning smaller patrol craft. Facing a guided missile destroyer bristling with sensors and helicopters sent a different signal altogether. It told them that the United States was willing to bring frontline warships to bear on cartel smuggling. At a time when Mexico's government publicly rejected U.S. military presence on its soil, the deployment of the Cole allowed America to project power offshore without crossing territorial boundaries. The ship served as a floating fortress, enforcing maritime law while sending a clear message the U.S. would not wait passively while cartels operated with near impunity. Cole's operations were not limited to drugs. Officials emphasized that her role was also deterrence. Advanced radar systems allowed surveillance of wide ocean corridors, tracking semi-submersibles that once slipped through the cracks. Her command and control suites fused intelligence from drones, Poseidon patrol aircraft, and Coast Guard cutters, ensuring that once a contact was detected, escape was impossible. Observers noted that the destroyer's presence shifted the balance of perception. Cartel smugglers, who had long framed their battles as speed versus patrols, now faced overwhelming force. At sea, perception is as important as firepower. When smugglers believe they cannot win, they hesitate to launch. And hesitation itself is deterrence. But Operation Pacific Viper was not only about one ship, it was about scale. Allied partners joined in the Royal Netherlands Navy's HNLMS Friesland among them. Together they formed a multinational barrier across key transit lanes. Still, critics asked, was the use of a destroyer excessive? Some pointed to the cost millions of dollars per week. But defenders argued that the cost of one failed convoy worth nearly $500 million dwarfed the expense of the deployment. The Cole's presence was insurance, a guarantee that the cartel's boldest gambles would fail. The larger question loomed. If the U.S. could deploy destroyers and seize nearly $500 million in drugs in under a month, what came next? As one senior officer bluntly put it, "We are not patrolling anymore. We are hunting." And hunting meant escalation. Cartels were already adapting, building larger convoys and testing new routes. The United States had answered with a destroyer scarred by terrorism, reborn as a symbol of strength. But would the cartels escalate again? Would they arm their boats with heavier weapons, or seek foreign suppliers for advanced gear? Those questions remained unanswered as Operation Pacific Viper pressed forward. What was clear, however, was that the USS Cole had transformed the battle at sea. It had become a statement that America's past wounds could become its present weapons, and that cartels would now face warships instead of patrol boats. The confrontation was entering its most dangerous phase. By late August, Operation Pacific Viper had seized more than 76,000 pounds of narcotics, detained dozens of cartel operatives, and sunk nearly $500 million in criminal profit. On paper, it was a victory. But commanders knew the war was far from over. Cartels adapt like militaries. Already, intelligence reports showed them testing decoy vessels, stretching supply chains through Central America, and building covert fuel depots hidden along remote coastlines. Each tactic was designed to outlast America's surge, to wait for the day when ships like the USS Cole rotated home. And that raises the larger question: how far is Washington prepared to go? Some lawmakers are pushing to designate cartels as terrorist organizations, a shift that would unlock new military options. Others warn such moves could inflame diplomatic tensions with Mexico. For now, that leaves the fight confined to open water, where U.S. destroyers and Coast Guard cutters wage a relentless battle of attrition. But attrition cuts both ways. Crews burn out, ships need overhaul, patrols stretch budgets. Cartel leaders know this. Their strategy may be to wait until U.S. focus drifts, then surge harder than ever before. Still, the message from the Navy is unmistakable. America will not surrender the seas. Each interdiction is more than a seizure. It is a warning shot across an empire worth $13 billion a year. And when a warship once scarred by terrorism returns as a hunter of cartels, it proves one thing: America's resolve cannot be outlasted.